Hi, I'm Peter from Coffee Parts, and we're looking at Fello's first espresso grinder, the Opus. This grinder was actually sent to us by Fellow pre-launch for us to review, but it got lost in transit. So they sent another one, and this is it. This is an interesting grinder by Fellow because it's their first grinder into the espresso coffee world. Before this, they were purely filter coffee, not only in their grinder, the ODE, but the whole range of products that they do. And a lot of people have been wanting this in the coffee world. Many people have gone in the Fellow Ode and modified it with SSP burrs to be able to grind finer and do espresso. So for Fellow to actually come out and do an espresso grinder has been quite nice. In saying that, they have targeted the budget side of espresso with this, a conical burr espresso grinder. But let's dive into this and see how the burrs work, what the workflow looks like, and what the specs of this grinder are. The Opus is a conical burr grinder focused on espresso that can do filter coffee, but the main focus is espresso. Now, being a budget grinder, to be able to achieve this, Fellow had to cut costs. And where they effectively cut the cost was on the body of this grinder. So compared to their filter coffee grinder, the Ode, this grinder has an all plastic body. And when you lift it, it's physically very light. But effectively being a budget grinder, they're focused on the actual workflow and the workings of the grinder rather than the expensive exterior. From a design principle and a design language, you can clearly see it's Fellow. It looks very similar to the Ode, but almost an inversion of the Ode. Where the Ode was square with a round body, you now got a square body with a round front, and the difference is in where it's ribbed. You can clearly look at this and it feels part of the Fellow family. The big difference being it's a first product from the Fellow family to be espresso focused, with everything else really being focused on the filter side of coffee. Now, when it comes to dialing in this grinder, Fellow have taken a different or a unique approach. It's always difficult to do a grinder that does both espresso and filter to be able to move between one and the other easily and still get those really micro adjustments when it comes to espresso. So what other grinder manufacturers have done, for example, the Eureka on all their Minion range, is they've got a really fine adjustment and a knob. But for you to go from espresso to filter and back, you have to do quite a few returns of that knob. When it came to say the Brazza Encore ESP, they've got 40 notches with the first 20 dedicated to espresso, second 20 dedicated to filter, and you've got two different pitches. So on espresso, you've got small movements, on filter bigger. What Fellow have done is been quite creative. They've got a stepped grinder that runs between 1 and 11, with 4 notches in between, so effectively 41 steps, with espresso lying down on this side of the grinder, being around the 1 to 2 range. Now, the vertical movement between each knot is 50 microns, which is too much for espresso. So you can easily just remove this hopper by lifting it, and when you do, it will shut off the motor from a safety aspect. You're not gonna have it turning burrs. And now you've got a blue collar. You can press down that collar and once again adjust it, and there you have your micro movements. So from this aspect, you can now dial in your espresso and quite easily then move also for your filter side of things. Being a budget or entry-level grinder, it's probably a little bit more complicated for those that haven't had much experience in coffee. So from that side of things, it is tricky, but they've handled it quite well in being able to really control the espresso and still have a filter grinder. But it is an espresso focused grinder. When it comes to grinding coffee, generally espresso tends to be around the 20 grams. Everyone's got their own personal preference. But what Fellow have done is inside the hopper lid, done 2 different blocks. 20 grams of coffee fit in here and 40 grams there. Now, for those that get more into coffee, generally you'd have a scale and you'd want to be weighing in 20 grams. And when you're making your espresso, depending on your ratio, you might be weighing out 40 grams or whatever that ratio is. But being an entry-level grinder, they've realized that most people won't have a scale, and just putting coffee into here, being roughly 20 grams, is gonna work at an entry-level side of things. Not something I'm recommending, but it's something that I could see people doing. The hopper lid is also quite tight, so although this grinder doesn't have a bellows, you could almost use it to push through the last remaining amount of coffee. In saying that, this grinder will generally grind 20 grams of coffee in the high 20 seconds, say 26, 27, 28 seconds. When it comes to operating the grinder, your switch is timed. And 1 press of the switch grinds for 30 seconds, 2 presses for 60 seconds, 3 presses for 90 seconds. So if you were grinding out 20 grams of coffee, so putting 20 grams of coffee in, pressing the switch, it's gonna finish grinding at about 26, 27 seconds, and those extra 3 seconds are gonna ensure that everything is pushed out. Now, it's not a zero retention grinder, so if you put 20 grams in, you may get 19 grams out. There is a bit of retention on this grinder. And you can either try and bellows it out like that, or tap the top of the grinder. Once again, this is a budget focused grinder, and we're almost talking about now kind of the top end of coffee where you really want to get that consistency, coffee in, coffee out, etc. When it comes to grinding noise, it's pretty much on par with most of the grinders at this price point. And I would even say a lot quieter than some grinders like the Breville. So here we go. That's the noise. So, although it might sound a little bit loud compared to, say, higher end grinders like the Eureka XL, for its price point, it's actually quite a quiet grinder. When it comes to the dosing cup, Fellow have taken an interesting approach. They've done a 2-in-1 dosing cup, so it works for both espresso and filter coffee. On the espresso side of things, it pretty much has a cup within a cup. So using this lid, you've got a cup inside, and on here you've got 2 different rings, depending on what portafilter, which ring it's gonna sit on. So on a 58ml portafilter, it sits on the outer ring, on a 54 on the inner ring. And effectively you now have a dosing cup for filter coffee. You grind into this cup, it is magnetized, so it will self-center, pull it out and pour into either your V60, Mocha Master, whatever it might be. When it comes to grinding speed, being a conical burr grinder, they do favor lower RPMs, and this grinder grinds at 350 RPMs, which is kind of a normal speed for grinders at this level. There is slower RPM conical burr grinders of similar size, like the Vari VS3, which is deliberately so 180 RPMs, but 350 is kind of normal. And lastly, when it comes to cleaning, also super easy. Once again, the hopper comes out just by turning it, and inside the hopper here, you can just turn a little lever and lift it up, and you're removing the outer burr. So very easy to clean that burr, clean the inner burr, put it all back together without any effort or fuss. And that's it. You will hear that click, that means the grinder's back on. So when you are removing the hopper, it is shutting off the grinder for safety reasons. So who do I see this grinder for? From an espresso side of things, especially for its price, it's super consistent. It's noisy, but it's a lot less noisy than other grinders at its price point. It's a little bit difficult to dial in for a novice, but it does give you a lot of control in the dial in. So I really see this grinder, based on its price, for someone starting out in coffee that's focused on espresso, maybe wants the ability to do filter, and has, say, a machine, something like a Breville or DeLonghi, or Gaggia Classic, maybe even a Rancilio Silvia. So more those entry-level coffee machines, they want a budget grinder that's well built, and the focus is espresso. Dialing in is my only concern because it is a little bit trickier. Once you get your head around it, it is quite easy. So I see it as an entry-level grinder for someone new to coffee. So what grinders does the Fellows Opus compare to? In a direct head-to-head comparison based on price point being conical, espresso and filter, you look at the Breville Pro Smart Grinder. Now, on a little bit more of a higher price point, you got the Vari VS3 and Ligon Mini. They're a little bit more in price, but effectively very similar characteristics. So I'm curious to know your thoughts when it comes to Fellows Opus. Do you like the direction Fellow took in 1, building an espresso grinder, their first espresso product, and 2, making it a budget grinder? Or would you have liked Fellow to have done a more premium, high-end espresso grinder? Let me know in the comments below. Happy with the approach, or would you have liked to see him do a high-end approach? And like always, if this video has brought you value, hit that thumbs up. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe. Thank you, and see you on the next video.